In 1955, E.J. Ruppelt, the former head of Project Blue Book, published his memoirs, and in my opinion, he summarized the whole UFO debate extremely well in 2 paragraphs. Quote, "This report has been difficult to write because it involves something that doesn't officially exist. It is well known that ever since the first flying saucer was reported in June of 1947, the Air Force has officially said that there is no proof that such a thing as an interplanetary spaceship exists. But what is not well known is that this conclusion is far from being unanimous among the military and their scientific advisors because of the one word, proof. So UFO investigations continue. The hassle over the word proof boils down to one question. What constitutes proof? Does a UFO have to land at the river entrance to the Pentagon near the Joint Chiefs of Staff offices? Or is it proof when a ground radar station detects a UFO, sends a jet to intercept it, the pilot sees it, locks on with his radar, only to have the UFO streak away at phenomenal speed? Is it proof when a jet pilot fires at a UFO and sticks to his story even when under the threat of court-martial? Does this constitute proof? Well, in my opinion, if this is the only proof we had of the existence of UFOs, it would be quite compelling. But the truth is, we have much, much more than that. And I'm going to lay all of that out for you and prove to all of you, except perhaps the most hardcore skeptics, that UFOs are indeed a legitimate phenomena, and that this phenomena is most likely visiting us from another planet. Good afternoon, angry astronaut viewers. I've got a quick, exciting announcement to make for you folks before we dive into this controversial subject today on UFOs. For a long time, my channel has lacked one big thing that other channels tend to be quite successful with, and really the viewers tend to really enjoy, and that is merchandise. I put out a wide variety of different things over the years, but none of them have really been all that popular. And the main reason for that is I was doing business with a lousy company, and so everything has changed dramatically, and I've got something very exciting to show you folks. First of all, for the alien fans amongst you, this one is entitled, "I Told You UFOs Are Real." This is an amazing piece of work. Again, all these designs are customized. They were created by my new merch company, Sunline in Texas. These guys are fantastic. As a matter of fact, let me show you an example of their work here. If you see that, it's just fabulous, fabulous colors. By the way, this is something that SpaceX actually sells themselves. They actually have merchandise for SpaceX at Boca Chica in Texas. Really, really comfortable fabric, and the color never fades. This thing has been through wash after wash after wash, and the colors just don't fade. Anyway, we also have something for the ISS Rescue. For those of you who are Crew Dragon fans, got a ISS Rescue Team piece of merchandise. Also, one for the angry astronaut in general with the Hohmann orbital transfer equation. Those of you who are big spaceflight fans, all of you know that. Well, that is sort of the new logo for my channel. So we got that merchandise. And finally, we have a piece of merchandise for the Apophis asteroid entitled "In 2029, Kiss Your Asteroids Goodbye." It has all sorts of information about Apophis and why it's such a threatening asteroid. I'll tell you, I'm so excited about all of this stuff. And here's the big announcement. First of all, I'm giving away 2 pieces of merchandise, as I said before, by March 22nd, either one to a Patreon subscriber, so one will be given away to a random Patreon subscriber, and one to a random Super Chat supporter. And number 2, this store closes on March the 22nd. So that's it. Actually, midnight, March 21st, but the early morning of March 22nd for UK viewers. So not a lot of time here. And the reason for that is that Sunline didn't charge me for this store. They didn't charge me for the merchandise. They're just taking a percentage and they want to see how these sales go. So that means that I only get this store until March 22nd, at which point we will see how well these sales go and whether or not this relationship is going to continue. So definitely this is the time to get this merchandise because it may be your only opportunity to get it. And here's my final incentive, sort of a contest. We will either have an Alien Week or a Space Flight Week or a Space Science Week immediately after the 22nd, depending on which merchandise sells the most. If the Angry Astronaut shirt with the Hohmann orbital transfer, if that one sells the most, then I'll do a Space Flight Week. If the UFO merchandise sells the most, then I will do another Alien Week. And finally, if the Apophis Asteroid shirt sells the most, then we will have a Space Science Week. Okay, I've spent enough time talking about all this, but there's a lot of information to unload on you folks. Really appreciate your patience. So let's get on with the topic at hand. How am I going to prove that UFOs really exist? Now, even though many UFO enthusiasts believe that UFOs are interplanetary spacecrafts or interstellar spacecrafts actually having been manufactured by another civilization, very seldom does an UFO documentary start out in space. But mine does, and for a very particular reason, because on July 19th, 1952, Palomar Observatory was undertaking a photographic survey of the night sky. Part of the project was to take multiple images of the same region of sky to help identify things such as asteroids. And around 8:52 that evening, a photographic plate captured the light of 3 stars clustered together. At a magnitude of 15, they were reasonably bright in the image, but at 9:45 p.m., the same region of sky was captured again, and this time the 3 stars were nowhere to be seen. In less than an hour, they had completely vanished. Stars don't just vanish. They can explode or experience a brief period of brightness, but they don't vanish. And yet, the photographic proof was there. The 3 stars are clearly in the first image and clearly not in the second. The assumption is then that they must have suddenly dimmed, but that is hard to accept because there is no scientific precedent for such a thing. Later observations found no evidence of the stars to dimmer than a magnitude of 24. This means they dim by a factor of 10,000 or more. In other words, a dimming that has never occurred anywhere else in the observable universe, or at least we've never seen anything like this. Now, the team of astronomers who recently made this discovery, led by Dr. Beatriz Villarroel, came to the conclusion that these weren't stars at all, but rather 3 bright points within 10 arc seconds of each other, 3 individual objects, and something must have triggered their brightening. And given the time span of about 50 minutes, causality in the speed of light would require that they be no more than 6 astronomical units apart and no more than 2 light years away. Indeed, what the team determined is that they were very likely 3 objects in geosynchronous orbit. What they really look like, when it comes right down to it, is 3 satellites of some kind in geosynchronous orbit. But of course, in 1952, there were no satellites in geosynchronous orbit. Certainly no triple asteroids in orbit that would have suddenly disappeared off of the plates. No triple meteor occurrences, nothing that can explain the appearance of these objects except the best explanation, 3 artificial objects in orbit that were there briefly and then vanished. Now, to be clear, these are recent discoveries. In 1952, nobody had the slightest idea that these strange objects had appeared on the photographic plates of the Mount Palomar Observatory. But what they did know is the day after these objects appeared in this photographic plate, the most sensational and well-documented mass sighting of UFOs in American history occurred. And I'm going to go ahead and relate the story of this mass sighting as told by Ed Ruppelt, the former head of Project Blue Book, a guy who was supposed to be a skeptic, not a ufologist, not a UFO historian, but a man whose responsibility was to examine all of these cases with a critical eye and try to find a rational explanation for all of them. Now, first of all, it's important to note that this incident involved a lot of radar detection of unidentified objects, so we need to get an idea of what radars were actually involved. Washington National Airport, which is located about 3 miles south of Washington, D.C., has 2 radars. One was a long-range radar in the Air Route Traffic Control section. This radar had a 100-mile range and was used to control all air traffic approaching Washington. It was known as the ARTC radar. The control tower at National Airport had a shorter range radar that it used to control aircraft in the immediate vicinity of the airport. Boiling Air Force Base was located just east of the National Airport across the Potomac River. 10 miles farther east, in an almost direct line with National and Boiling, was Andrews Air Force Base. It also had a short-range radar at the time, and all of the airfields were linked together by an intercom system. When a new shift took over at the ARTC radar room at National Airport, the air traffic was light, so only one man was watching the scope. The senior traffic controller and the 6 other traffic controllers on the shift were out of the room at 11:40 when the man watching the scope noticed a group of 7 targets appear. From their position on the scope, he knew that they were just east and a little south of Andrews Air Force Base. In a way, the targets looked like a formation of slow airplanes, but no formations were due in the area. As he watched, the targets loafed along at 100 to 130 miles an hour. Then, in a sudden burst of speed, 2 of them streaked out of radar range at supersonic velocity. These were no airplanes, the man thought, and so he let out a yell for the senior controller. The senior controller took one look at the scope and called in 2 more men. They all agreed that these were not airplanes. The targets could be caused by a malfunction in the radar, they thought, so a technician was called in, but the set was in perfect working order. The senior controller then called the control tower at National Airport, and they reported that they also had unidentified targets on their scopes, and so did Andrews. And both of the other radars reported the same slow speeds, followed by a sudden burst of speed. One target was clocked at 7,000 miles per hour. By now, the targets had moved into every sector of the scope and had flown through the prohibited flying areas over the White House and the Capitol. Several times during the night, the targets passed close to commercial airliners in the area, and on 2 occasions, the pilots of the airliners saw lights that they couldn't identify, and the lights were in the same spots where the radar showed UFOs to be. Other pilots to whom ARTC radar men talked on the radio didn't see anything odd, or at least that's what they said, but the senior controller knew airline pilots and knew that they were very reluctant to report UFOs. The first sighting of a light by an airline pilot took place shortly after midnight when an ARTC controller called the pilot of Capital Airlines flight just after taking off from National. The controller asked the pilot to keep watch for anything unusual, and soon after the pilot cleared the traffic pattern, and while ARTC was still in contact with them, he suddenly yelled, "There's one off to the right, and there it goes!" The controller had been watching the scope, and a target that had been off to the right of the Capital airliner suddenly vanished at high speed. During the next 14 minutes, this pilot reported 6 more identical lights. About 2 hours later, another pilot approaching National Airport from the south excitedly called the control tower to report that a light was following him at 8 o'clock level. The tower checked their radar scope, There was indeed a target behind and to the left of the airliner. The ARTC radar also had the airliner and the UFO target. The UFO tagged along behind and to the left of the airliner until it was within 4 miles of touchdown on the runway. When the pilot reported the light was leaving, the 2 radar scopes showed that the target was pulling away from the airliner. And once during the night, all 3 radars, the 2 at Washington and the 1 at Andrews Air Force Base, picked up a target 3 miles north of the Riverdale radio beacon north of Washington. For 30 seconds, the 3 radar operators compared notes about the target over the intercom. Then suddenly, the target was gone. It left all 3 radar scopes simultaneously. But the clincher came in the wee hours of the morning when an ARTC traffic controller called the control tower at Andrews Air Force Base and told the tower operators that ARTC had a target just south of their tower. The tower operators looked and there was a huge, fiery orange sphere hovering in the sky directly over their range station. Not too long after this excitement had started, in fact, just after the technician had checked the radar and found that the targets weren't caused by radar malfunction, ARTC had called for Air Force interceptors to come in and look around, but they didn't show, and finally ARTC called again, then again. Finally, just about daylight, an F-94 arrived, but by that time the targets were gone. The F-94 crew searched the area for a few minutes, but they couldn't find anything unusual, so they returned to base. And this ended Phase 1 of the Washington National sightings. But this was only the beginning. A large series of sightings, both visually and on radar. Every conceivable method of detection picked up objects that were definitely not aircraft, definitely not meteors. And what I think is the most significant thing about this rash of sightings, and this is something that was never reported until John Michael Gaudier, a colleague of mine, reported on this topic a few months ago, is the fact that all of this happened in the immediate aftermath of 3 mysterious objects apparently appearing in geosynchronous orbit and disappearing about an hour later at a time when there were no man-made artificial objects in space at all. And the most common argument that UFO skeptics use is that there is no clear connection between UFO sightings on Earth and an extraterrestrial origin. Well, this discovery changed all that quite decisively. And this is not the only example of space-based encounters being confirmed on the ground as well. For example, on August 13, 2020, a Russian cosmonaut, while creating some time exposure footage of the aurora borealis from the International Space Station, spotted something that stood out pretty dramatically, especially at a time when SpaceX Starlink launches were only just beginning. A grouping of 5 lights near the horizon that appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. The cosmonaut had seen satellites before. As a matter of fact, you can see one in this footage, but these were different. These were strangely bright, large objects that were reflecting the sun or perhaps giving off their own luminescence in a place where they shouldn't be, and also traveling in formation. And interestingly enough, this sighting took place at a time when a Starlink launch had not recently happened. In other words, at a time when Starlink satellites would not be closely packed, but rather would have separated by now and definitely would not be traveling in a group of 5 satellites anyway. Now, what's very interesting about this sighting is on the same day, a ground observer, an amateur astronomer, also spotted 5 lights in time exposure footage. Almost precisely the same lights in precisely the same formation, once again happening at a time when Starlink satellites would not be closely packed anymore. There was a launch on August 7th of 2020, but in 6 days, Starlink satellites satellites don't remain that closely packed, and once again, not 5 of them, and there were no other satellite launches at the time, at least no clusters of 5 satellites that would correspond with this sighting. Instead, we must conclude that this was a sighting of artificial objects that do not match with anything manufactured by humans. And while we're talking about space and potential extraterrestrial origins for UFOs, we need to talk about another UFO sighting, or rather 2, that took place orbiting Mars. Huge cigar-shaped objects, not too dissimilar from Oumuamua, that were photographed by the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviets photographed something resembling a cylindrical or cigar-shaped craft in 1989, one of the last photographs that the Phobos 2 probe managed to take before it mysteriously malfunctioned in the immediate aftermath of taking these photos and crashed into the surface of the Red Planet. By the way, this story was related to the public in the early 1990s by a decorated Soviet test pilot. Her name was Marina Popovich. We're not talking about ufologists here. We're not talking about people who have made their careers studying UFOs. We're talking about respected military personnel who are making these claims. And incidentally, this wasn't the only photo that Phobos 2 managed to take. While it was plunging towards the Martian surface, it also took this photograph, a shadow cast by something enormous and elongated on the surface of Mars. Anything big enough to cast a shadow this big would have to be several kilometers in length, or perhaps a little bit bigger than Oumuamua. And as I suggested before, this is not the only time that cigar-shaped objects have been photographed in Mars orbit. Decades later, the Curiosity rover spotted something in the Martian skies, the night sky as a matter of fact, slowly descending towards the horizon. Curiosity photographed the object for a grand total of 10 minutes, which means it couldn't be a meteor. Meteors wouldn't stay in the sky for 10 minutes or longer. It can't be a time exposure streak because that would impact the stars in the background as well. It can't be the moon Phobos. For one thing, Phobos isn't cylindrical, but also it's moving far too fast through the sky. Phobos doesn't orbit nearly that fast, so what the hell is it? Well, the only logical conclusion I can come to is it was the same cylindrical object that was photographed by the Phobos 2 spacecraft back in 1989 when it too was orbiting the Red Planet. And so when the Air Force and Aero and other military organizations, including NASA as well, claim that there is no connection between UFOs and an extraterrestrial point of origin, these UFOs by definition are extraterrestrial, and they're not the only examples. But also, we need to talk about UFOs that can enter another medium, namely the water. The USS Omaha, an extremely advanced U.S. Navy ship that was launched on November 20th, 2015, and equipped with some of the most sophisticated sensors and processing systems, including Sea Giraffe 3D surface-to-air radar, Bridgemaster E navigational radar, and also infrared sensors, spotted this object. Actually, this is one of many objects that apparently swarmed the U.S. Navy vessel on July the 15th, 2019, and it shows the object not only hovering over the water, but eventually plunging into the water as well. And keep in mind, we're talking about a ship that has the most sophisticated jamming systems available to the U.S. military, something that easily could have jammed a conventional drone or even a reconnaissance drone from a hostile nation, and yet it didn't. And so after this brief review of UFO sightings both on Earth and in space, let's go ahead and revisit E.J. Ruppelt's statement about proof. What constitutes proof? Does a UFO have to land at the river entrance to the Pentagon near the Joint Chiefs of Staff offices? Or is it proof when a ground radar station detects a UFO, sends a jet to intercept it, the jet pilot sees it, locks on with his radar only to have the UFO streak away at a phenomenal speed? Is it proof when a jet pilot fires at a UFO and sticks to his story even under the threat of court-martial? Does this constitute proof? Well, does it constitute proof when we have dozens or maybe even hundreds of cases just like this one, and so many of them have stood the test of time and remain unexplained? In my opinion, the proof of the existence of UFOs, at least an unexplained phenomena that defies natural causes, defies any mundane explanation that skeptics can come up with, I think the proof is definitely there. But we are going to examine further proof of this phenomena in part 2 of our UFO finale episode. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and close with one of the most famous recent accounts, one of the most famous recent military encounters with UFOs, and you tell me whether or not this constitutes proof.
Dude, this is a fucking drone, bro. There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots to the west. The whole thing, dude. That's not our LNS though, is it? It's not. That is LNS, dude. Well, if there's like... Look at this thing. It's rotating.